Welcome to China in Context from the SOAS China Institute at the University of London. I'm Duncan Hewitt. After the drama of Donald Trump's Liberation Day and the 145% tariffs he imposed on China and Beijing's retaliation with 125% tariffs of its own, trade negotiators from the two countries met in Geneva earlier this month and agreed a 90-day pause while they engage in further talks, with President Trump proclaiming they've agreed to fully open China. But the 10% reciprocal tariffs and a further 20% imposed by the US for what it says is China's failure to prevent exports of chemicals used to make the opioid fentanyl remain in place. And since the Geneva talks, the US has announced that it will seek to punish any business anywhere in the world that uses AI chips made by the Chinese technology giant Huawei, while Beijing has threatened retaliatory legal measures against anyone who enforces this. So is there really a chance of a lasting and meaningful trade deal between the two countries? Well, today we're joined by two Americans with, I'm tempted to say, almost a century of experience in China between them. Ken Jarrett is a former US Consul General in Shanghai and later headed the US Chamber of Commerce in that city, and is now a senior advisor in Shanghai to the strategic advisory firm Albright Stonebridge Group. Jim McGregor is the chairman for Greater China of the consultancy APCO Worldwide and was previously CEO of Dow Jones in China and the Wall Street Journal's China bureau chief. Well, thank you both so much for joining us. Jim, you've also been advising the American Chamber of Commerce in China, and you took part in its annual door knock, meetings with US officials and members of Congress. So what's the mood in US government circles now about the prospects for these trade talks?
Well, as you know, I was in Washington last week doing meetings with the American Chamber, and we met with think tanks and with the administration and Congress. And I think what I come back with is they really don't know what their end objective is. And people are saying, "What are you trying to get out of it?" And if you look at the process, basically, Liberation Day tariffs happened because Peter Navarro had the president's ear. And Peter Navarro has this economic theory of balanced trade that nobody else seems to adhere to. And so what they did is they kind of moved him and Secretary of Commerce Lutnick, away from the trade negotiations. So they're starting to sort it out.
Peter Navarro obviously is the senior counselor for trade and manufacturing to President Trump and was the sort of trade advisor during Trump's first administration, who has spent a lot of time calling for this complete decoupling of the US economy from China.
So, I mean, right now, people are just kind of sorting out what does Washington really want, because there's a lot of different opinions, even though there's a lot of anti-China sentiment in Washington. There's not a lot of consensus on all these tariffs and all the noise it's making and the troubles that it's causing business.
When you say there's not a lot of consensus, do you mean between different parts of the US government?
Oh, yes, very much so. They don't speak about it loudly because no one wants to speak against the president, because there'll be a lot of online retribution. But if you talk to members of Congress, I mean, one senator told us, "Look, you don't get a medal for putting out your own fire with these tariffs that went up, and then you bring them down again." And they're very worried about the long-term implications of doing this simultaneously with everybody in the world. What are we doing for our standing in the world? And how will people view us as any kind of a reliable partner? There's also ideologues who do believe that we should decouple, but they are not the majority by any means.
What are businesses saying to you about how they're being affected, both those who export to China and those who are importing from China, of course?
Well, they look at these tariffs of just reinforcing Xi Jinping's wanting to de-risk from the United States. And so they're looking at this as this can be something that will encourage China to really try to abandon American business as much as they can.
Just because China will lose any trust that it had in doing business with the US?
Yeah, and they've seen the power that the U.S. has right now with tariffs like this, and how it really could have hurt the Chinese economy and the Chinese building their technology and expanding their manufacturing base. But they're kind of schizophrenic in that the Chinese government is being nicer to American business than they've been in many, many years, because they don't want them to leave. But at the same time, they're very aware that Washington doesn't want them there anymore. Our message to the government was very strong in that if you want to compete globally, you've got to be in China. I mean, the number one reason is the size of the China market. The market's going to continue growing, even though it's slower. The second reason is Chinese innovation. China innovates at China's speed. You've got to be there to be able to take advantage of Chinese innovation. And the third one is they think that their next global competitor is coming out of China because these Chinese companies are very good, and you better know who you're going to compete with or maybe who you're going to partner with. And those were the three main reasons that I hear from companies, and we were pushing those in Washington.
Did you receive any kind of favorable hearing, would you say, from any parts of the administration or people that you talk to in these departments?
Yeah, it was very favorable across the board because when Trump isn't in the room, there's a lot of reasonable people looking at these things.
So are these
And
people more the kind of career civil servants, or are they also political appointees
well, members of Congress
from both
are pretty.
sides?
Yes, because many of these Republicans are not so extreme. They depend on business for their campaign contributions and their support. A fairly senior member of the administration said to us, "The U.S. is redesigning globalization and not retreating from globalism. We still need integrated supply chains." So there's a lot of practicality that lurks underneath the desks in Washington.
So, Ken, you obviously spending a lot of time in China still. What would you say is the feeling from Chinese companies, of course, who are directly affected, but clearly also the views of the government are very significant in this. How do you think they really see what Trump has done and the situation it's left us in?
Right. So this is the flip side of what Jim has been speaking about. We do need to break it down into different segments, of course. So just to give one example, the morning after the Geneva talks concluded and surprised everyone with, a positive outcome. One of my local, I live in a compound which is very local, so I'm the only foreigner there. And my neighbor came up to me and he said, "Oh, Trump lost." So you have this dimension of things where in China, it is a spectator sport for most ordinary citizens. They may not feel that this has a direct bearing on their life. And for them, it's a question of, who blinked first. And in the views of most Chinese, President Trump was the one who blinked first. While I might argue that both sides blinked for different reasons, whether or not the U.S. blinked a microsecond first, that's probably a fair statement. But still, both sides blinked. And then for the commercial world in China, no, I mean, there is, with all of the talk of China's resilience and how they're better prepared for this time around, this has been a big worry for the Chinese business community for sure, which is why China was willing to blink as well. And, they know that it has a big impact on manufacturing jobs. And even with the decline in terms of the percentage of Chinese exports that go to the United States, it's still quite a sizable chunk of their exports. And a place like Shanghai, which is very export oriented and has a strong tie to the United States in particular, you feel this more strongly there. So for manufacturers, they were worried about what to do. So I had one Chinese businessman came up to me and said, well, he has 4 plants. He employs 2,000 people altogether. He's doing something that's very consumer focused, so he can't continue just to manufacture for a long period of time. But he was worried that if he laid everybody off, what if in 6 months things sort of come back to the status quo ante and he can export again? Will he be able to find people? So it's very disruptive, to companies that are trying to manage a business in a coherent way.
And how do you think that affects public perceptions of the US or of President Trump? We hear that some people see it as a bit of a joke and think the Americans have embarrassed themselves, but presumably there are business people who feel that their whole livelihood depends on this and is affected by this volatility.
So a couple of interesting dimensions on that. Companies do track social media postings very carefully to see if there's anti-American sentiment, and all U.S. companies, particularly consumer-facing ones that are perhaps more iconic in terms of brands, they've been very worried about the potential for a boycott against U.S. products, which has not developed. But there has been an uptick in, I would say, actually anti-Trump sentiment because of the strong association that he's in charge of everything in the United States, so he's taking the lead in terms of responsibility for the tariff war between the two countries. And then there's been a sense of confusion and, to some degree, even disappointment with the United States. I would say the disappointment is less related to the tariffs and more related to the domestic issues that have been playing out from the very beginning of the Trump administration. So particularly, attacks on education institutions or on the scientific community in the United States.
Because that presumably affects a lot of Chinese people who either
right.
send their kids to study, or a lot of Chinese scientists, as we hear about, thinking of leaving the US now, going back to China.
So aspects of the United States that Chinese have respected for decades, have come under attack, and people just don't understand why the United States would do this. That's something that has tarnished President Trump's reputation, because it's true that there has been this respect for him as the quintessential businessman, transactional individual. But the haphazard way in which the U.S. policy is unfolded in terms of the tariffs on and off, and nobody can sense a coherent strategy behind it. This also has caused people to have second thoughts about, I guess, how smart or clever Donald Trump might be.
In terms of how the Chinese government has responded, do you see that they have handled the situation calmly and cleverly? As you mentioned, some people have said that, well, China won because it was Trump who blinked, but you also pointed out that China gave some ground as well. I mean, it at least gave Trump the chance to sort of back down without completely mocking him or walking away. So where do you think that leaves us?
China a pretty good score for how they play this. Of course, the reaction to the first two rounds of the fentanyl-related tariffs, those two rounds of 10%, China's response was quite measured. And then when the U.S. responded with the high levels of reciprocal tariffs on China, you could sense that China changed policies as well. And they got angry and upset and maybe a bit emotional about it because they overreacted, I would argue, in terms of sort of matching.
So this is when
tariffs.
China brought in 125% total tariffs.
Hitting 125% to the U.S. as 145. They weren't going to be humiliated and they weren't going to beg. And, the question of who would call first. China, of course, they did take the position that they wouldn't sit down to talk with the United States until the U.S. removed tariffs, and they sort of quietly forgot about that demand. So that was where they gave. Now, whether or not this plays, this is successful in the long run for both sides, we don't know yet. So there's plenty of tension between the United States and China. So it's important not to focus purely on tariffs because we have the whole technology competition, and now the United States is going after Huawei for their Ascendus chips. You have the USTR ruling on maritime issues and port levies that'll be imposed on China. So there's plenty that each side can do to damage the other. And at the moment, China has pulled back their countermeasures. It looks like the U.S. is, first out of the gate in terms of revving up its various actions against China, and whether or not China just tolerates this, hoping that they can maintain the momentum of Geneva. That will be something to watch.
You mentioned this situation with Huawei. So the US Commerce Department has called on all countries to basically ban the use of Huawei chips. Jim, what do you think is the rationale behind them doing that? Is this just a sort of bargaining chip in these ongoing negotiations, or is this, part of this wider tension over technology that Ken just referred to? And is that something that is here to stay, do you think?
Oh, I don't think that's a bargaining chip at all. There's a very, very strong consensus in Washington when it comes to technology. And we'll be seeing more and more and more of that, I think, especially chips. It's about competition and a security risk. For both countries, this goes to their military. China is very, very unhappy with this, and it goes right to the PLA and to the national security people in Beijing who are, knee deep into figuring out what to do about this.
People's Liberation Army as well as national security, yeah.
But one of the things that was interesting is as we talked to the China-focused think tanks in Washington, they were pretty much on the view that China had smartly handled this, that they had pushed back and woken up the administration to the power China has as a manufacturing superpower. But one thing that was interesting, they said, is China's happy with one aspect of the Trump administration, and that's that the Trump administration is about power and leverage. And China's about power and leverage, and China is very good and experienced in using power and leverage to get what it wants. What China really hated in dealing with the US when the basis of discussion was values. And that's now disappeared from the scene under Trump. So they're feeling they know who they're dealing with. And you talk about the the negotiations with all these countries. One administration official told us off the record that we could perhaps be seeing 90 days followed by another 90 days followed by another 90 days, because the U.S. has put itself in a very difficult position with these tariffs on every country. And it's going to be pretty hard to be doing comprehensive deals with this many countries. So they expect this 90 days to go on. And they also are aware that it's about the big show. It's not so much what the deal is, it's having a show that is a big win, as we're seeing with all these announcements of investments, these trillion-dollar investments from the Middle East. A lot of that is fanciful if you look at the real details. So it's quite an interesting time to be watching Washington.
I would agree with Jim on the 90-day sort of issue, because for companies who are looking at this pause, it would be a surprise if the two countries could reach some kind of even a tentative agreement in 90 days. So the assumption is, as long as there's enough progress, the White House would be able to justify an extension. The problem for companies is a decision on an extension presumably would be made at the 11th hour. So if you're a company and you're trying to make decisions, everyone is treading water at the moment. And the question is, how long can they continue to do so without drowning?
Well, I would just say that around Washington, there is many people who realize and believe that time is on China's side. You just got to look at the numbers. You got to look at what we get from China and what we get back. If you wanted to have balanced trade, we don't sell enough stuff to get anywhere near what would balance out with what we get from China. How do you have a trade agreement between the US and China with big numbers? It's going to have to involve investments. It's going to have to involve Chinese investments in the US and perhaps some more investments by US and China. But the US is already deeply invested in China, and I don't think it's going to rush ahead on any kind of a trade agreement. They know what they're doing there, but there's a lot of Chinese companies that want to get in the US. There's many in Congress who think that's a bad idea and don't want it, but it's amazing how quickly members of Congress will change their mind if the president puts out a tweet and says he likes it.
Chinese companies coming into the US.
Yes.
As investors.
Well, look, China is ahead of us on EVs, batteries, a lot of green tech and others, and they're a peer competitor in so many others. And so we could benefit from Chinese investment by learning their technology. I think we should do joint ventures like they did with us in the 90s. Let Chinese companies come in joint ventures with American companies.
But Ken, you were talking about the Chinese perspective. How do you see the Chinese government's response to this in the longer term? They've talked a lot about boosting the domestic economy, boosting consumption, and trying to improve China's own technology, of course. So what do you feel they can actually do in practical terms? Are they going to be seriously diversifying away from exports to the US and other major economies? And is that viable with the levels of what many people call overcapacity?
Well, to begin, I guess at the big macro level of grand strategy for China, there's nothing about the tariff war that will cause them to change their notion about what they feel is a U.S. determination to slow down China's development or to contain China, to put it in somewhat Cold War language. So that's there. And that means in terms of China's determination to increase their own self-sufficiency, particularly in technology, that will remain very strong. Their outreach to the global south or other parts of the world, that is getting additional steam. It's possible that, we'll see stronger action in terms of stimulating domestic consumption. Some observers have said that President Trump has really helped to deliver this. Finally, it's something that, the foreign business community in particular, everyone has been looking for China to make domestic consumption a more considerable part of GDP. And, this trade war might actually help bring that about. Although so far, in terms of China's fiscal and monetary policy, they're still not departing too much from the strategy they've had in place for a couple of years, which is to focus on the technological transformation of the country, to move up the value chain, to sort out the property market issues and local government revenue sources. So even their efforts to stimulate consumption have been pretty measured. But this might start to pick up steam because diversification of markets. This will continue to get another, additional emphasis. So we've seen already, if you look at the figures that came out of the National Bureau of Statistics earlier this week, Chinese exports to the U.S. year over year in April dropped 21%, but exports to ASEAN and Latin America and the Middle East, I think in all three they grew by double digits, which is why you still had export growth, not as strong as the previous month, but actually better than people had thought. So the business community is moving, smartly to find alternatives to the United States. But the U.S., it's still a key market. So there are plenty of challenges, and the tariffs come at a particularly awkward moment for China, for a economy that does face, a range of headwinds. So it is something that the government has to somehow try to sort through.
Jim made the point that the Chinese government is actually going out of its way to be quite welcoming to US businesses and US investors at the moment. Do you think that in the current climate they're going to seriously push for an increase in foreign investment, which they have talked about earlier in the year, and clearly after a few years in which the world was very much cut off from China or vice versa?
I think the question maybe isn't will they push for it, but will the foreign business community respond to it? Because China has been pushing for this for a long time, but the response has been pretty tepid because of all of the geopolitical tensions and the fact that China's economy is growing at a much lower level. So particularly for large companies that are looking at global opportunities, China, although still a high priority, the case isn't as strong as it has been. So companies have been redirecting elsewhere. I guess I'd argue that companies will still have a pretty hesitant and cautious response to these overtures. So the overtures are more helping companies, to address problems that, that are already operating in China and to help them to sort through whatever bureaucratic or regulatory issues they might face.
But they do want to at least look a little bit more open for business than perhaps they did 2 or 3 years ago. Do you think that will continue at least superficially?
We'll continue with baby steps. I mean, this is always, if you look at the famous negative list over the years, so it always reduces by an item or two each time. But
those are the areas that foreign companies cannot invest in, right?
Right. But foreign business community, I mean, it doesn't get that enthusiastic about these changes.
So they open up a little bit, but it's maybe a token gesture. Jim?
We should also pay attention to the burgeoning negative list in the United States on what the United States will allow American companies to do as far as investments in China. Right now, that's kind of on the back burner, the outbound investment restrictions. But you got this America First investment policy. Companies are very aware of that. I know our AmCham door knock, there was more than a few companies that did not allow their representatives from China to come on the door knock because they do not want to highlight their presence in China. Remember, you still have the Select Committee on China in the House of Representatives, which doesn't have legislative power, but they are writing letters all the time to companies saying, what are you doing in China? I want you to list this. I want you to put this out, put that out. People do not want to be facing that. Companies are trying to keep their heads down right now.
Do companies feel that it's like some kind of a witch hunt? What are your links to China, as it were?
Oh, very much so. In fact, I was even told there's some companies, American companies in Beijing, that don't want to be seen going into the U.S. embassy because on the other side, they don't want to be seen if they could be helping the U.S. on any kind of restrictions on China because that is blown back against other companies. It's just a very fraught political time. Let me give you a little overview of Washington as it is today, the backdrop for these negotiations taking around the world. The people we met with in the agencies, Treasury, Commerce, State, even the NSC, these were career people mostly, many of whom we know because they've been through the U.S. Embassy over the years in various assignments. And, they're just keeping their head down and trying to be very professional and move things forward. But the agencies are being gutted. The firing of all the probationary employees, the young people, they're gone. I mean, we met with the Commerce Department. They said that all of their administrative staff, secretaries, schedulers, whatever, are gone. It's hard for them to even function on a daily basis. Just a few days ago, May 13th, Christopher Landau, the Deputy Secretary of State at the Select USA Investment Summit. This is what he said, and this was pointed out to me by a few people. The principal objective of our foreign policy is not to harangue foreign nations about so-called soft international norms, encourage virtue signaling, but to secure real results for American business and American workers. To countries around the world, here is my message. We are an administration you can do business with. We are open for business. So good. We're open for business. You can do business with us. But it basically is just they're dismissing all the soft power actions of the US government as being a waste of time and superfluous, if not damaging.
Obviously, there's been a lot of talk about the US losing significant amounts of soft power. I mean, we saw Marco Rubio appearing at congressional hearings, and he was, criticized not only by Democrats, but by people like Lindsey Graham, the Republican senator, for giving China what some described as a massive global propaganda win with the cuts to the USAID, the Agency for International Development, and obviously the sort of closing down effectively of Voice of America and Radio Free Asia. And many people are wondering what is the rationale behind this? I mean, where do you think it leaves the US?
It leaves the US significantly weaker. American soft power has been so strong for, since World War II. Yeah, we make a lot of mistakes. We've done some wars that maybe should not have been done. But America had a message, and it had a way of life, and it had rule of law in the Constitution. You get rid of that, and then you just go and you threaten every country.
Well, Ken, you've been a US diplomat in China over many decades. What's your perspective on the longer term implications of this, and to what extent is China sort of reveling in this and also potentially standing to profit from it internationally?
Well, of course, for some of these decisions, I hope that in a few years that they will be reversed and we'll see the return of some of these institutions. But still, it does so cede the field completely to China in terms of, for Voice of America, Radio Free Asia. Why the Trump administration would decide to shut these down is a bit mystifying to me. I mean, they represent government point of view.
And of course, they were, from China's point of view, they were seen as extremely critical of China, and China has been delighted to see what's happened to them.
I have no sense in terms of listeners in China how they feel about it, but I'm sure that for those who actually were regular listeners, that they're quite disappointed that these have gone away. There's a long history of people using VOA for, at the very least, for English language learning, but also to pick up content, from an alternative source. So that is very short-sighted and, disheartening to watch. And it will give openings to China in its effort to develop its own soft power. But we have to keep in mind that China's soft power progress has been quite slow. So they have, handicaps of their own. Not that the U.S. should be complacent about this, but China, which has been preoccupied with the notion of soft power for quite some time, has stumbled a lot. So if you look at the polling data in terms of how Americans view China, China hasn't moved the needle very much in terms of its image in the United States. But so around the world, as you look at these global surveys of attitudes toward China, whether it's Africa, the Middle East, or Latin America, I mean, the attitudes are more positive.
Do either of you have any sense that the US or that some influential people in the US are starting to think that maybe there is a risk in giving China at least, a sort of short-term soft power or propaganda boost by the way that the world has reacted to the tariffs?
Huge realization.
But only among the sort of liberals, or more widely?
Among the non-crazy. It's among a lot of the Republicans, too, who understand this. But this is now a party that is run by one man who, if you differ from him, you will get attacked. As Senator Murkowski from Alaska said, we're scared. It really is breathtaking, the power that Trump has taken over the Republicans. And a lot of the Republicans that maybe had a backbone, they left. There's a lot of people, they can understand that the U.S. needed to kind of do a reset, but a reset by bullying the world and really cutting back on important powers and influence the U.S. has had around the world is not good for us. So how sustainable is this? That I think is a question. We got the midterm elections next year. These members of Congress will want to keep their jobs.
Just to go back to the actual negotiations, which clearly in theory now will continue over the next couple of months, and then, as you say, potentially further. What do you think are the prospects of some sort of a deal? Do you think we will see another trade deal that somehow both sides will be able to herald as a great success? Or do you think that this time is actually going to be much harder when they get down to the nitty-gritty, particularly given these kind of attitudes among Trump and his acolytes that Jim has been talking about?
I think we will see a deal for the same reason that the two sides felt that they had to talk. The question is how big in scope. So for me, I would say the most likely outcome is a deal that focuses mainly on tariff levels, with something else has to be thrown in. Otherwise, we really would not have achieved very much if we just are imposing tariffs and we take them away and just return back to the status quo ante. That's not too much of a deal. So whether or not those other elements are linked to a more welcoming attitude for Chinese investment in the United States, I think that would be high on China's list. China, of course, will have asked in the technology area. That strikes me as impossible or very difficult, to ease technology restrictions. I don't see that the U.S. has any flexibility on this, as Jim has already discussed. Whether or not, other countermeasures, are eased by this, I'm referring to sanctions or various entity lists, or in the case of China, their use of M&A reviews to make life difficult for companies. This is something that perhaps we might see some progress, but the most likely outcome would be a limited deal, because the level of suspicion and mistrust is just so deep. And even if China makes pledges about purchases of things in the United States, the record on this isn't really that great. And then there's a question of, what could the U.S. sell, since China has already been reducing its purchases of agricultural products, and it's not that easy to move it away from, Brazil, for example, to the United States.
So this would be things like soybeans and
right,
the like.
Soybeans, other grains. But there's not that much really, for China to buy from the United States. So even though I'm optimistic that we'll have something, it may not be that substantive. But this gets back to something that, Jim had mentioned before, that for the Trump administration or for President Trump. So what is his objective in terms of a deal? Is it just a cosmetic deal that he could, trumpet as, a historic win, as they put out in the White House press release after the Geneva talks? Or is it really something of substance? And I'm inclined to feel that something that is really just cosmetic, but politically can be sold as a big triumph, will be sufficient.
I mean, one thing that is referred to a lot on the US side is this question of the fentanyl, these chemicals that are being exported from China and used for, making drugs. And the Chinese government has said that it's cracked down on this. The US says it hasn't done it seriously. Do you see any space there for some serious progress?
So I should have actually mentioned that. So that does strike me as one that, would have to be in the list. I really don't know enough about how to assess what China has done. Certainly, the U.S. feels it's woefully insufficient, and I'm sure that China can actually do much more. So I would assume that this would be part of a package.
And Jim, what's your perspective from the U.S.?
Let me go to the larger issue. Of course, they will cobble together a trade deal. And of course, it will be the biggest deal ever. And it will be a comprehensive, wonderful, game-changing, world-beating deal in the White House press release. And the Chinese will portray it however it makes them feel good, and of course makes the administration look good. But what's really at stake here? We have two very different systems, both of which are successful in their own way. And they are intertwined, and in some ways they are incompatible. In other ways, they are very compatible. Trying to sort that out, because what does the U.S. ask on China? Change your system. You can't have all these subsidies. You can't have all the controls you've got. You must have a free market capitalism. We basically have authoritarian capitalism versus free market capitalism. And what has the effect on that been to the U.S.? Well, the U.S. basically is following China's lead on industrial policies now. So who's changing who?
You mean because some of Trump's policies are sort of more like Chinese protectionism?
Well, and industrial policies under Biden, the CHIPS Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, these are industrial policies that the U.S. has not had in years, in adopting them in order to compete with China's industrial policies. Look, China's got a very different system, and it works well for China. It's messy, it wastes a lot of money, but they get a lot done. They have no desire to change their system. They think it works pretty well. But when that system leaves China's borders, it can be very predatory because it's got all these advantages from all the industrial policies, all the subsidies, but also just, they've been spending all these years building these incredible supply chains and incredible talent pools. And now with these US deal going on, and the US trade tensions going on, all the overcapacity of China's manufacturing, countries around the world are all going to face that. So let's not forget about the drama that's going to be going on in so many countries involving China and a flood of exports. But also, let's not forget that, the British agreement had, what I'm told, are 17 clauses that deal with China, and it doesn't say the word China. It says with security. The U.S. is going to be pushing this as a template of sorts, so that when you do a deal with the U.S. on trade, you're also going to have to say what you will do and won't do with China as part of that, restricting what you can export to China, basically, on technology.
So from based on what you've just said, how does that affect the prospects for any kind of viable deal between China and US negotiators?
Well, viable is the word. I think it's about coming up with something that looks good and settles things down. I think China and the US.
You think both sides want that?
Yeah, there was a ceasefire. The US is in a terrible position with China. They misread China. They must have been listening to Peter Navarro or others who have not a deeply informed view of China. Anybody that knew China knew they were taking the wrong approach. You don't threaten China. You don't tell Xi Jinping, if you don't change a tariff by next Wednesday, I'm going to give you another one. And China's in a very strong position. I mean, all the products that Americans live on are from China, so much so that Trump has to threaten Walmart because they're going to raise their prices because of tariffs. This reaches the middle class. It reaches the Trump voters. So China's sitting in a fairly strong position, I think, because they also have a different system and they can hold out longer. Not that this couldn't be tough on China, but China, somebody told me that, remember when Vice President J.D. Vance basically gave a quote that denigrating China as a bunch of peasants, in other words.
He said we borrow money from Chinese peasants to buy the things those Chinese peasants manufacture.
I was told that over all the millennium, the Chinese emperors never really were able to unify all of China, but J.D. Vance did it in one sentence. They're feeling pretty put upon by not only the trade stuff, but just the attitudes.
Duncan, on your question about the impact of anti-China elements in other trade agreements, this will have a big impact on the U.S.-China relationship in terms of the staying power of any agreement. So even if both Jim and I feel that an agreement is likely, but whether or not it lasts is a question. China is very attuned to pressures from the United States and others. So we've seen this in comments they made when the U.S. was leaning on Vietnam, and then China issued this warning to other countries that if you actually entertain these provisions, we're going to come after you. And then we're seeing this right now with the U.S. Commerce Department's announcement about Huawei's Ascendus chips. And so overnight, China reminded foreign companies that if you actually support this, we're going to throw the anti-foreign sanctions law at you.
I know that you have said that China sometimes also misreads the US. I mean, Jim talked about the US in certainly the Trump administration misreading China. You've said, I think, that Xi Jinping is sure that the United States is in a state of permanent decline. Right. So you feel that this is a misunderstanding on the Chinese side that could lead them to make mistakes?
Maybe 6 or 7 or 8 years ago, there was this strong sense in China that the leadership felt that the U.S. was a declining power, and this would mean that China wouldn't have to be as mindful of U.S. points of view, or that things were trending their way. But as the U.S. economy has continued to outperform China's in many ways, I think there's been a realization that perhaps the U.S. isn't in as steep a decline as China felt. But for Xi Jinping, who's very much, I guess, takes a Marxist-Leninist view of historical cycles and trends, I guess my suspicion is that he still feels that this is the overall dynamic. I have greater faith in the United States in this regard, and so I would argue that China's leadership is not fully appreciating some of the inherent strengths of the United States and could make incorrect decisions if those decisions are based on the notion that the U.S. is in permanent decline.
I would just echo that in the United States, there's a lot of people that dismiss the inherent strengths of China, and that that China is just waiting to fall apart. When the U.S. economy has trouble, we say the U.S. economy has trouble. When the Chinese economy has trouble, the next sentence we say is collapse, at least, in the US. There's not a realization of the power of China, of the power of China's scientists, the power of China's technology, the power of its workforce, and the skills and how advanced China is today.
So it sounds like this is probably a subject that we're going to be talking about a lot more in the future, especially if there's that level of potentially mutual misunderstanding. But as I think both of you are suggesting, there are also other people, probably on both sides, certainly on the US side, who would hope for a different approach in the longer term. I mean, do either of you feel in any way optimistic about China-US relations in the future?
Well, maybe long term, it's a question of how far out we're going to look. I do feel that we're in a particularly bad spot at the moment, and we will, return somewhat toward a center point that is less tense or free of controversy as right now. But I wouldn't take that too far because the structural tensions that are at the core of U.S.-China competition are permanent. So that's not going to abate, and it's more taking the time for the two countries to work at a new operating system, actually, between the two of them, where the U.S. has to be more accepting that China will be an equal partner on the global stage. China has to recognize that it needs to do more, perhaps, to explain what its objectives are and what it's looking for, so that people don't feel as apprehensive about the role that China might play in the future.
I'd like to be optimistic. My only optimism would be that the younger generations, are more understanding of the world in many cases. They've traveled, they're educated on both sides. I would be more optimistic if we would get more of these young people-to-people exchanges going. We used to have 15,000 American students in China. We've got about 1,000 today. The number of Chinese students in America is dropping, even though it's still formidable. We need people-to-people to bring an understanding between people, because that will prevent conflict. But when it comes to the government level, it's oil and water. The way it is between the US and China now, both sides are paranoid of the other. And so if they take an action out of paranoia, on the other side, it's looked at as an action that's predatory. So we may have ginned ourselves up into this very perilous situation because both sides are worried about the other, and they take these actions out of fear of the other one. And meanwhile, the other one looks at it as predatory, and we just keep bouncing towards each other. Hopefully that cycle could be reversed.
Well, Jim McGregor and Kenneth Jarrett, thank you both so much for talking to us on China in Context.
Thank you, Duncan.
Well, that's all we have time for on this episode. You can find information about SOAS China Institute events and read our latest blog articles on our website, soas.ac.uk. For now, thanks for listening and goodbye.